Greetings everyone. I want to take a look today at doing some simple average, mean, median, mode types of calculations using Google Sheets. The examples that I'm using come from the 4th chapter of the Discovering Statistics and Data from Hawkes Learning, and I'm specifically going to be showing you how to do these calculations using Excel, as well as talking about what the calculation is. So one of the most basic calculations that we usually do in Excel is, or in any statistical area, is an average. It's not always the most useful, but it's one of the most basic. Most people have learned long ago that in order to do the average, I'm going to take and add all of these things together and then divide it by how many things I have. Now, there's ways to break this down into multiple steps using a number of Excel formulas. For example, I could use the sum formula in order to see the sum of all of this data. I could also use the count formula just to count how many pieces of data, didn't highlight all of them, how many pieces of data that I have. And so if I combined those, I could say I want to do the sum formula divided by the count formula. If I wanted to do that all at once, I could say the sum of everything in column B divided by the count of everything in column B, and kind of do that all in one go. Now, that just shows you how some of the formulas we use, and sometimes we have to kind of build them by hand, but for a simple average, that formula is built right into Excel. Equals the average. And if you don't always remember the names of the formulas, you can use the little drop-down menu that gives you some of the most basic ones, like that sum and average and count formula right here in the sigma drop-down. But it also gives you a lot of extra measures and tests that you might not even know. Hovering over them will tell you what it is. Clicking on them will put it in here, as well as give you instructions about how to do that. So the average formula is simply equals average. You can either highlight or you can type in the range. And you'll notice, since we're doing the first 10 cells in column B, that's why it's B1 colon B10. If you want to do all of the cells in column B, just B colon B is everything. One of the reasons I strongly recommend not putting anything below the data that you're working with, or to the right of it if you're going to work across rows. So the average of B column B. Now, one of the things that we also want to understand is that we can possibly be using a trimmed average. Now, this average is really skewed by the fact that there is this one piece of data that's over here at 490. Right? So one of the things we sometimes do is we'll say we're going to do a trimmed average. So in this case, I am going to do a 10% trimmed mean. Now, that really means I am going to drop 10% of the numbers on both sides. So since there's 10 numbers here, 10% of 10 means I'm going to drop this number. So let's fill this with red, and I'm going to drop this number. Right? You could go ahead and do that by hand and say, well, if I'm dropping 10%, I just want the average of the 80% that's left, right? So really, 10% means I dropped 20%. 10% on the bottom, 10% on the top. That's the 80% that's left. But I don't want to have to count and figure out how much that is. So in Excel, we have a trimmed mean. So notice trim mean, and when I open this up, it wants to know the data, once again, column B, and it wants to know what proportion to exclude. Now, even though I'm doing a 10% trimmed mean, that means 10% on the bottom, 10% on the top, that's 20% total. So I'm going to put a 0.2 in here for 20%, and you will see that it matches the average that I did just of these numbers before. Right? So one of the questions in this section of the textbook asks us to do a couple of things, and I'll label them over here. A lot of times when I'm looking at data, like the set of data from chapter 4.1, number 10, it wants to know the mean, the median, the mode, and I am also going to do a 10% trimmed average. I think these are the things that it asks for in that. And so I can do it very quickly. In the case of mean, which is really just another word for the average. I am going to use the average formula for column F. The median really takes all of these numbers and divides it in half and tries to find the number that's right in the middle. But because there's an even number of them, it's somewhere between 10 and 11. And again, I could count it and then I could find the average of those two numbers, but I am going to do equals median, again, of column F. And it's going to find the number. Notice this number, 93.35, is right between this data is not in order. I would actually have to rearrange all this data in order to find out where the mean or median is. So a lot faster just to use the median. If you wanted to put this data in order, I would recommend always having a label at the very top. And now I can highlight this range, or I can just click on the label and put in a filter. Just clicking on this to create a filter, and it gives me the option to sort this A to Z. I only put a label in on this one, or the filter right now, to sort that data. Now I'm counting is off by 1, so somewhere between 10 and 11 is actually between these two numbers, right? So 92.88 plus 93.83. I could take all of that and then divide that number by 2 to get the same 93.35 we had before. Once this is arranged in order, you can also use it to find the mode. And this is where it does get tricky. You could have more than one mode, but right away I'm noticing there are 3 92.27s. Mode is just the most common number. So the mode of column F is the 92.27. The trimmed average for column F, I want to do a 10%, which means I have to trim the mean by 20%, 0.2. And there is my average, median, mode, and trimmed average. Now the final thing on this page is weighted averages. This is very often used when you're calculating your GPA. So for example, here is the grade that you got, as well as the credits that you had. And basically I took an example from the textbook and said, well, if you get a B, that's a 3.0. This is a 4.0 for an A C is 2.0, and then a 4.0 here. To do a weighted average, normally we would say, well, the average grade you got was equal to the average of the grades. But that's an unweighted average. That's if each one of these courses was the same length, right? It's kind of like what you do in courses as well when you take a quiz and it's weighted as 20% of your grade versus the tests are weighted as 30% of your grade. That's a weighted average. So in this case, we have to take the actual score times the weight. The credit hours is the weight. This means that this 5-credit course is the most important and the heaviest weighted course here. So we could do that by hand by saying I am going to set up a formula to multiply the number of grade, or the grade, by the number of credits. Notice I'm not typing those numbers in. I'm just clicking on the cell, the asterisk, to multiply them together. I'm going to click and drag this down. Here is my weighted grade, right? And it's not an actual grade, 9.0. No one knows what a 9.0, but that's the weighted version of this. So to find the weighted average, I would take the sum of the weighted grade and I would divide it by the actual weights. Whoops, and I need to divide it by the sum of the actual weights. So in this case, adding all these things together, if you want to see it broken out, the sum of L and the sum of K, and dividing the sum of L divided by the sum of K gives me that 3.133. Now there's a better way to do this. Again, since I have these arranged like this, in Excel there is a average dot weighted. And what it asks for is the values. Like here's the actual grades, comma, the weights. And doing that, it will automatically do the multiplication and do the addition at the end of the division. So a weighted average, you just have to have the score and the weight arranged next to each other. And they don't have to be right next to each other, they can be at different places, but they have to match up from left to right when you're doing that. From one array to the other array has to match. But that is a weighted average. The final thing I'm going to talk about is a moving average. So again, this is an average gas price in the United States in 1991 to 1996. So I could find the entire average of this like I have done before and say like, oh, I just want the average of all of these things that are over here. It's 1.145. A moving average takes a look at the last however many periods. So in a 2-year moving average, it wants to find the average of the 2 previous years. So in 1992, the 2-year moving average is going to add these two together and divide by 2. So I could put that together, but I am going to, again, use the average. And because Excel is positionally aware, the average of just these 2 pieces of data, B2 and B3. Again, the nice part about Excel is when I click on this and drag it down using that blue corner, it changes for the next one, it finds the moving average of B3 and B4. If I double click on it, it'll show you the cells that it's actually finding the average of. And so it's always finding the average of the last 2 years. Consequently, the 3-year moving average, I can't start it in 1992 because I need 3 pieces of data. So I'm going to do the average for the 3-year moving average of 1991, 92, and 93, and then do the same thing again. Click and drag that down and you'll see the 3-year moving average. Some other things in here, if you want to kind of sharpen up your data, you can decrease the number of decimal places. For example, if you wanted it to round to 3 or 2 decimal places, whatever fits, you can also increase that. I could do the same thing over here and say I want there to be 3 decimal places so that it all matches, as an example. I only had 2 decimal places here, so I'm not sure why I would want to show it to 3, but just in case you would like to do that. But that is how you use Excel to do a lot of different types of averages, both mean, median, mode, the trimmed average, and the weighted average.